If anybody needs a Bible, you just put your hand in the air and Kyle will bring a Bible around to you. Otherwise, if you would, join us. We're going to be in Mark chapter 13. We're going to pick up in verse 14. And Mark is going to essentially move us into the halfway point of the tribulation. So we're picking up verse 14. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing where it ought not, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not go down into the house, nor enter to take anything out of his house. And let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. But woe to those who are pregnant, and to those who are nursing babies in those days, and pray that your flight may not be in winter. For in those days there will be tribulation, such as has not been since the beginning of creation, which God created until this time, nor ever shall be. That's quite the period in time. What is Mark telling us? That at this point that we are introduced to in verse 14, at this point, the last 3.5 years, time times half a time, or 1,260 days, these times are going to be the worst that it's ever been. Ever in all of history. So what is that event? The Abomination of Desolation. What is that event, and what is everything that entails? We're actually going to spend quite a bit more time than normal in a passage, but verse 14, that's kind of where we're going. Zechariah chapter 13, verse 8 kind of shows how heavy the situation is going to be, showing that 2/3 of Jews are going to be killed. Jeremiah chapter 30, verse 7 says this is the time, and this is important, that this is the time of Jacob's trouble. What was Jacob's name changed to? Israel. This is very Israel. This is very Judah. This is very Jerusalem. This is especially very temple focused. By the time we hit, chronologically, by the time we as a society hit verse 14, the church is already going to be gone. As we discussed last week, we are going to go through intense periods of persecution. We will still have trials. We will still be persecuted. That's going to be kind of one of the aspects of the Christian life. But this period is not for the church. So when you see the abomination of desolation, what is that? So when we see that word abomination, especially as we're moving through Genesis and through Genesis to Malachi, typically whenever we see that word abomination, it's a very heavy word. It's almost always used in conjunction with idolatry. So we're going to have an idol, we're going to have someone stand in the temple, which we'll get to out of Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, that will declare himself to be God. Now this verse would have been really hard. It would have been really hard for the disciples to kind of take in. Why is that? For us, for the church, the book of Daniel is where? The book of Daniel is in with the prophets. It's the last of the major prophets before you get into the minor prophets. But it's not that way in Jewish literature. They see it as a historical book. They see this as already being fulfilled in the 2nd century. In 167 BC, Antiochus IV, or Antiochus Epiphanes, had on the altar in the temple, had offered a pig on the altar, which is not supposed to happen, offered a pig up to Zeus and was demanding worship to Zeus and for himself, as he kind of saw himself as a reincarnate of Zeus. The abomination of desolation is an idol or worship being directed where it's not supposed to be, that is going to bring desolation. It's going to bring wrath. And we really ask ourselves, this is pretty bad. We have to remember, or we have to really pay attention to the bottom of verse 14. Let the reader understand. I love that passage. I really love passages like that in the Bible. We do occasionally banter back and forth. Well, what's for me and what's not for me? Certainly there are promises in the Bible that we pray on that really is like, oh, can't wait till this happens. It's like this has nothing to do with you. This very specifically is dealing with Tyre or Sidon or Jerusalem or whatever the case may be. It's like, man, like this passage is just really wrecking in my life right now. It's like, that passage is only for Damascus. Like, I think you're going to be okay. What passages are directly for me? Let the reader understand. That's you. That's me. That's us. Let the reader understand. I love it when the Word is calling us to dig deeper into the Word. So we see this event that is going to basically kickstart the day of Jacob's trouble, the last 3.5 years, the worst time that it's ever going to be. But what is that event? Who is the one controlling that event, and how does he get there? It's interesting that so much through just this chapter, we see a lot of the words being used over and over and over again. Like watch, be watchful, be careful. That's how he's going to finish this discourse. And what I say to you in verse 37, I say to all, not just to the disciples, not just to the Jews, but to everybody, to watch. So let's delve into that situation, that event, the abomination of desolation. What are we dealing with? Something is going to be put in the temple that's drawing worship where it's not supposed to. Something is not supposed to be worshipped. That was loud. So let's look at that one. First, if you need verses afterwards, absolutely hit me up because we're going to kind of plow right through these. In 1 John chapter 4, we're kind of given this warning. By this you know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is of God. And every spirit that does not confess that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is not of God. And this is the spirit of the Antichrist, which you have heard was coming and is now already in the world. So we have a spirit of something, someone in the world now that does not confess Jesus Christ, that does not worship or bow to Jesus, does not recognize Jesus, but rather recognizes himself. In Isaiah chapter 14, we get to see essentially where that starts. For you have said in your heart, chapter 14, verse 13 of Isaiah, you have said in your heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will also sit on the mount of the congregation on the farthest sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. So we have that spirit of the Antichrist, and we see essentially what is fueling it. Satan has the exact same mentality. Not your will, but my will. He demands worship. In 2 Thessalonians, now, brethren, concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, and our gathering together to him, we ask you not too soon be shaken in mind or troubled, either by spirit or by word or by letter, as if from us, as though the day of Christ had come. Let no one deceive you by any means, for that day will not come unless the falling away comes first. So first we're going to see a great apostasy, a falling away and an abandoning of the truth. That is going to come first. We ask ourselves, well, how does this happen? How is it that we get to the point when we start, and those of you that are with us through Daniel, we will kind of move through Daniel a little bit this morning. Those of you that are with us through the book of Revelation, that's a pretty serious thing. What is it that we're dealing with the Antichrist? We're dealing with a one-world government. We're dealing with a one-world religion. One man being in control of those things, among a handful of other things. How do we get to that point? Really, it kind of boils down to three things. One, lack of knowledge, which is why we keep saying, let no one deceives you. So many times, especially in Mark chapter 13, we're called to watch, pay attention, be vigilant, be sober-minded, be paying attention. We also have a matter of indoctrination, as well as indifference. We'll cover indifference in a moment, but indoctrination is kind of the one we're focusing on now. Once we kind of start breaking the boundaries a little bit, we establish essentially a new baseline. We establish a new normal. Well, this isn't that bad. We dealt with this kind of thing in the 60s or the 70s or the 80s or whatever. Or, our matter of indifference. Well, it's not going to get much worse than this. So Paul is warning the church in Thessalonica not to be deceived, to pay attention, because there is going to be a matter of apostasy, a falling away. In verse 4 of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, this is his mission: who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. That is his focus. We answer a lot of questions dealing with the temple and with the Jews. The question that was proposed is, well, how come the Bible, kind of paralleling the lines of replacement theology, but why are we focused so much on the Jews? Why is so many things focused on the temple? Who cares? It's one of like the tiniest slivers of land that's being fought over. Why is it that the church is spending that much time in prayer for the Jews? What is the focal point? The Jews have something nobody else does, or did, and they will have. That's the temple. There's only one, and there's one place for it, and it's in Jerusalem. That's why there is so much fighting. That's what the enemy wants. How do you, not to say that he's going to win, he's not going to be the best, because obviously we know, we've read the end of the story, we've seen the ending of the movie. He loses. In fact, if you finish Isaiah chapter 14, you get to verse 15. So he says that he's going to ascend to the heights of the clouds. He will be like the Most High. Verse 15, yet you shall be brought to Sheol, to the lowest depths of the pit. He loses. But how do you become the best? There's only one way. You have to beat the best. If the best kind of retires and you never get a chance to beat him, that's why we keep records, scores, to try and beat and try and top. There's only one way. For Lucifer to exalt himself, since he has been deposed from heaven, the only way to really exalt himself and declare worship, demand worship, and to sit as God is to do it sitting in the temple. So we see who he is. We see what he wants. He wants worship. It's a forced worship or death. Something we see paralleled in Daniel chapter 3. We had that great big 90-foot statue that Nebuchadnezzar built. It's interesting that he built the statue, isn't it? What did Nebuchadnezzar discover in Daniel chapter 2? He had that scary dream. Great big colossal statue, Colossus. And it had a head of gold. And he was told very clearly in Daniel chapter 2 that head of gold was Babylon. Then the chest and arms of silver, which was the Medes and the Persians, and the abdomen and the upper thighs of bronze, and that was Greece, and the legs of iron, and that was Rome. And then the mixture of iron and clay, that kingdom that hasn't gotten here yet. At this point, his kingdom. That period where the Antichrist reigns. What did Nebuchadnezzar do in chapter 3? No, Lord, not your will. Because Daniel tells him, God has shown you what's going to happen. What does Nebuchadnezzar do? We're not doing the whole arms of silver and all that bit of nonsense. So he creates a statue, head to toe, full gold, and demands that it be worshipped. What happens if you wouldn't worship the statue? You went right into the furnace. Absolutely normal for everybody, except for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Kind of an interesting type, which we'll continue to develop later. So we're moving into a place of forced worship or death. How does he get there? We like to really think about it. It's like, nope, I'd see that one coming. I'd see it coming a mile away. You're not going to be here. This concept of salt and light is not going to be here. The true church, those that are actually following Christ, those that are digging in, those that want to have that deeper relationship with Jesus, they're not going to be here. So how is it the Antichrist is going to get his way? So from there, we will move into the book of Daniel. You don't have to really turn there because we're going to be hopping around quite a bit. Let's just look at some of the things that the Antichrist is going to be involved in. In Daniel chapter 8, starting verse 11, what does he want? He wants to exalt himself as high as the prince of the host. How is he going to do it? two ways. He will take away the daily sacrifices, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. And in verse 12, he will cast truth down to the ground. So removing or trampling, for lack of better words, true religion or truth, and he's going to essentially institute his own. Continuing on in verse 8, we see that his power, in verse 24, shall be mighty, but not by his own power. And he will destroy fearfully. That's interesting. It's not by his power. He's going to be powerful, but it's not by his own power. So it's not like the Antichrist is just going to get raised up and he's just kind of a super dude. And he is just so suave and just so great, he's just going to completely take over everything. He's being empowered by somebody else, which is why we see his mission the same as Lucifer's mission, which we'll get into in Revelation chapter 13. But what's interesting is it says that he's not going to be mighty by his own power. So you really have to ask, well, if he's not mighty by his own power, there's probably a cycle to look at. He doesn't want Christ's will or God's will done. He wants his own will done. Do we have a picture of that? Do we have a cycle of that? Just in the Word, how many others? We had Nimrod. Nimrod was kind of introduced to us, I think, in Genesis chapter 11. A mighty hunter in the face of God or in opposition to God, and what is it that he was hunting? Doesn't really give us any specifics, does it? Except when you continue rolling in through the chapter, we see the establishment of Babylon, and that he wants to gather all peoples to himself so that they can make a name for himself. So we see it as something of a type in Nimrod. We see it in Pharaoh in Exodus chapter 1, trying to destroy all of the Jews, all of the Hebrew male children being cast into the river. We saw it in Herod in the book of Matthew. You remember his conversation with the wise men. When you find the king and you worship him, come and tell me where he is. I want to go worship him too. But the wise men, being warned in a dream not to go back in Herod, they went home another route. Herod found out of their deception and decided to kill all children in Bethlehem 2 years old and younger. The enemy trying to stop the plans. We see it in Nero. We see it in Domitian. We see it under Titus and Vespasian in AD 70 at the destruction of the temple, which kind of spawned this whole teaching. And then just to gain context, it's important for us to actually read the prophecy, Daniel chapter 9, that piece came out of. 70 weeks or 77s are determined for your people and for your holy city. So that really does kind of give us context. What is this period of time for? For the holy city, Jerusalem, and for the Jews. To finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. That command being Nehemiah chapter 2. The street shall be built again, and the wall, even in troublesome times. And after 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end of it shall be with a flood. Until the end of the war, desolations are determined. Then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. So many notes, I almost lost a word in there. But in the middle of the week, he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abominations shall be one who makes desolate, even until the consummation, which is determined, is poured out on the desolate. So that last week of Daniel, the last 7 years, we'll get into essentially what's going to kickstart that last 7 years, but at some point in the beginning of that 7 years, what's really going to start this timetable, is going to be a covenant. They're trying to rebuild, and they're going to be rebuilding the temple. For example, they're going to be rebuilding, and there's going to be war. There's going to be strife. Look at how it's been since 1948, when they became a nation again. There's been a lot of trial and toil and hardship and struggle trying to do the things that they're doing. So during this period, there's going to be a covenant for 1 week. There's going to be all of these hard things happening. someone, the Antichrist, is going to be able to really capitalize on that situation. He will be able to seize control. He is going to look like the answer. You have to remember, as we went through the book of Revelation, it's like, man, how is anybody going to buy off on that? We have a lot of speculation about the Antichrist, where he's coming from, what his heritage is going to be. It's like, well, the Jews are never going to buy that one. The Antichrist also has a forerunner. He's going to have a false prophet. So they're going to confirm this covenant, and he's going to look like such a good guy 3.5 years into the covenant, in the middle of the week, time times half a time, he's going to break that covenant. And he's going to set up worship for himself in the temple. At that point, just as Jesus had warned him in the rest of those couple of verses we read, things are going to get way worse. Things are going to be so much worse for you. Everyone wants to see the dedication of the temple. That's a big deal. They haven't had a temple since AD 70. Almost 2,000 years. That's a long time. Now they're going to have a temple. Think of everything that goes into the temple. What do you need in the temple? You need all the articles of the temple. So now I got to go through and refashion some of those. But you need priests in the temple. The priests need trained. But before you train the priests, what do they need? You got to find them. You got to be able to identify exactly who comes from the Levite background. Who is going to be the priest in the temple? So this is going to be a great big ordeal. And everyone's going to be patting him on the back. You did a good job. Way to bring peace, way to bring order, way to protect us. You gave us our temple, and then the tables are going to be turned. In chapter 11 of Daniel, in verse 36, talking about the nature, it says, "Then the king shall do according to his own will. He shall exalt and magnify himself above every god. He shall speak blasphemies against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the wrath has been accomplished. And what has been determined shall be done. He shall regard neither the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any god, for he shall exalt himself above them all." A lot of people get really mixed up about that verse. They like to teach, well, the Antichrist, he's going to be homosexual because he doesn't regard the desire of women. That's not what that verse means. This passage is written to the Jews, for the Jews. What was the desire of women? The Messiah. The birth of the Messiah. He's completely speaking against all things that are holy. Moving into chapter 13 of the book of Revelation. In verse 4, "So they worshipped the dragon who gave authority to the beast." Now we get to see it kind of come around full circle. Makes sense. Satan wants to be worshipped. Why would he turn that worship over to the Antichrist? Why would he turn that worship over to a state-controlled religion? He will allow it for a short period of time. We like to think, well, what is that religion? It's an apostate religion. It's going to be a blend, only up to a certain point. We see in verse 4 of chapter 13 in Revelation that they are worshiping the dragon, that dragon being Lucifer, because they gave authority to the beast. So much so he says, who is like the beast? Who is able to make war against him? And then we see the rise of the false prophet in verse 12. And he says that he causes those on earth to dwell in it, who dwell in it, to worship the beast. He performs great signs. He deceives those who dwell on the earth by those signs, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image of the beast. Verse 16 and 17, he causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their foreheads, that no one may buy or sell except who has the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. How does he get it? How does he get there? 3 ways: lack of understanding, indoctrination, and indifference. That's how it happens. And we have, because of a lack of understanding, extremes on both sides. We've already seen people having the marks on their hands, the little chips that has their bioinformation or banking data. We've seen some of those. What has the church done? Church as a whole. That guy's the Antichrist. Look at that. That's the mark of the beast. It is not. How do we know that it is not? None of this other stuff has taken place yet. They're already strongly, and we'll kind of get into it in a minute, I think, kicking around the concept of vaccination passports. It's too much effort carrying around a piece of paper that shows your vaccination, so they're going to put it in your hand. That way you can just quickly, like a thing at the grocery store, beep, they can tell if you've already been vaccinated. Oh, that person's the Antichrist. That's a lack of understanding. But rather indifference and indoctrination. It's becoming something of a new normal. We are already used to maintaining a 6-foot distance. We are already used to people, oh, he's got the sniffles. He's got COVID. He'll be dead in 3 days. Stay away from him, they're cursed. Like, we're already at that point. That's already normal. Is it not? We're already at that point. In the 80s, I'm pretty sure it was the early 80s, I could be wrong, when they first instituted the concept of gay marriage. All the uproar. Even though it followed shortly after removing prayer, the Bibles, and Roe v. Wade. So it really shouldn't have surprised us that much. But we have this huge uproar about gay marriage. Where can they go? We see certain states, certain countries kind of legalizing it early. Now, what does it mean to everybody? Nothing. To each be their own. A level of indoctrination or indifference or lack of knowledge. Now let's discuss the concept of indoctrination. Or I guess first we'll kind of back up a little bit, how he gains a little bit of steam. This is a quote from Washington Examiner, that you never let a serious crisis go to waste. And what I mean by that is an opportunity to do things you think you could not do before. That's a sound tactic because it works. If you're the enemy and you've got the big show coming up, you've got to do a couple of trial runs. Look at how many different things that we have done in this process that have really kind of opened our eyes to some of the text in the book of Revelation. But how does someone really get there? They're going to use some sort of a crisis as a foothold to springboard them into it. Sorry, I have a whole bunch of notes here. Into the concept of indoctrination. Just kind of getting used to it. Sometimes indoctrination is a quick level of time. What we saw in the book of Daniel, chapter 1, for those of you that are with us, Daniel chapter 1, we see Daniel along with a ton of other exiles in 605 and then 596 and I think 587 BC, those 3 waves where they pulled the Jews into Babylon. They carved out for themselves a handful that looked nice or smelled nice or were smart or were nobles. They carved them out for themselves so they could do what? So they could make them Babylonians, so they could indoctrinate them. They changed their names. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, those aren't their names. Do we remember what their real names are? We remember Daniel. Daniel was Daniel's original name. But that's not what they changed his name to. Do we know what they changed his name to? Belteshazzar, yeah. So we see that level of confusion. We see them changing the education. They learned Babylonian history, Babylonian literature, Babylonian language, their concept of math or construction, their culture. They taught them those things. They also made concession. They didn't eat what everybody else ate. They got something a little bit different. They got something a little bit extra. They got to eat meat, fruits, vegetables, whatever else that nobody else really had access to. So we see a small level of indoctrination. Images, idols. How used to that are we? How many of us have a lucky something? Some people have a lucky pendant or a lucky hula girl on their dashboard. How many idols do we really kind of look at nationally? Like the Statue of Liberty, or the bell, or a flag. We get very used to it. So if you look at these images kind of worldwide, you can kind of see that we're just used to it. So by the time it comes to that point, it's going to be, well, it just is what it is. Government worship. That sounds really dumb to us, doesn't it? Why would we worship our government? They're full of, X or Y. We've all got our, this president was great, but this president, oh my goodness, he was the worst of all these other ones combined. Why in the world would you ever worship government? We saw in the time of Christ, kind of getting there, but certainly in the times of Paul, Peter, and the apostles, when they were taking the word out, there was a level of government worship, which is what made things so hard for the believers. Once a year, they had to take a pinch and put it into the fire of the offering and say, Caesar is Lord. Kind of started a little bit with Augustus, but it didn't get heavier until Nero and Domitian, where they were really demanding it. That's when they started noticing Christians. We have idols, we have statues now as gifts that look a lot like, and I've got the images here, it's not something we were able to put up on the screen this morning. If you want to look at some of these images that look a lot like something that's coming out of the Bible. One of my favorites, I haven't had time to fully look at it yet, it's called the Giant. And I do have the website down here so that you can look at it, but it's going to be a 112-foot statue. And it will have millions of addressable LED pixels, giving it the ability to instantly take the form of any person, from historical figures such as Einstein or Amelia Earhart to stars of today. Each hour, the Giant will transform into each country's national heroes and celebrities. The Giant's arms and head can move to a diversity of positions, and the images of the men and women appearing on the statue can speak or sing. That's nuts. Isn't it? One, technology is just amazing. The kind of nonsense that we can do. Some of these guys never watched Terminator. But that's my own bit. But it's important to really look at the aspect of this. This is what kind of is a little bit, nerve-wracking, or it can be. The image that we see in the book of Revelation, it is an image. Even in the Greek, they give it a very specific. It's a dead image. It's just a block. It's just something. But then they will give life to the image. There's a couple of different words for life in the Greek. One we see is pneuma, or wind, and the other one is bios, biology, study of living things. Like we get that one. It's not the word bios. It's the other one, pneuma. This thing will be some sort of an animatronic. That's just kind of interesting, because it's going to be put up all over the place so that it can be worshiped. So you can kind of see how we get from point A to point B. So what is it we're dealing with in verse 14? There is going to be an act of worship that will bring wrath. A very intense wrath. The devil, the Antichrist, is finally going to make their play at that point to demand worship. And his wrath will be poured out on the Jewish nation. He's going to hunt them down. As we've seen through the word, that's at that point where they're going to take their flight probably to Petra. And they say that it's so bad. If you're out in the field, don't go back to your house. There's nothing in there worth your life. That's kind of an interesting point now, which we'll get into. If you're even on your roof, he says, don't go back down into the house. What's the other option? You're going over it. That's how important, that's how much emphasis they're giving to that text. It's going to be so bad you don't want to be caught in it. Pray that your flight is not in the winter, or that you're pregnant or nursing. Why? Because your travel, your abilities to move about are going to be that much harder. We discussed that in the book of Revelation. We were talking about the mark of the beast as we were traveling through Revelation. Well, there's no way that I'm ever going to take the mark of the beast. You say that now. We won't be here. But if we have a hard time making a stance now, you're going to have a hard time making a stance in that intense persecution. Well, let's just think about it realistically. Husbands, fathers, what would you do for your family? What would you do for your kids? There's one way to buy bread. There's one way to make money. And that's to yield. That's to compromise. How many of us now in just our professional lives or our personal lives, how many of us have made the wrong kind of compromise? It's like, well, the ends justify the means. I really don't have much of a choice. This is the way to get this done so that the mission can be fulfilled. I've been there. I've had a ton of adverse compromises. Man, I shouldn't have done that. But food's on the table. Which is why we had the warning that we did last week in verse 13. He who endures to the end will be saved. To remain under, to not be so desperate for escape that you compromise. Verse 20, and unless the Lord had shortened those days, no flesh would be saved. But for the elect's sake, whom he chose, he shortened the days. That's how bad it is. It is shortened to 1,260 days. Given to us in Revelation. Time times half a time given to us in the book of Daniel. It's shortened. Why? Because if he didn't, nobody would survive. It's going to be so bad, even those elect that are protected in the tribulation, they probably wouldn't survive either. Like, it's going to be that bad. Then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or look, he is there, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will rise and show signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. So we have those, like the Antichrist, that have like the spirit of the Antichrist, or the kind of the essence, his same mission, his same goals. To deceive, to lie, to kill, to steal, those same goals, to win people to his side, you're certainly going to have that. But like we read in some of our quotes, don't miss the opportunity. How many great ideas was born out of adversity? Umbrella. How was the first umbrella invented? I don't know this for a fact, but I'm just speculating. Probably some dude that was bored standing in the rain. It's like, you know what would be a good idea? Something like a barrier. Windshield wipers. Some of us are a little bit cheaper. Windshield wipers are not cheap. Well, what are we going to do for a little while? We've got that friend. Dude, stick your hand out the window and wipe that. I can't see anything. Out of adversity, we come to the place of, it's time. You're going to have people, they're going to try and capitalize on somebody else's pain. They're going to turn to those that are promising safety. And let the reader understand. Take heed. See, I have told you all things beforehand. I like that. Take heed. Pay attention. Look at this very closely. You have to ask the question, why? Why take heed to that one? First of all, it should keep us light. It should keep our fingerprints, it should keep our hand, our grasp on the world light. Very light touching. We are told to occupy until he comes. We saw that in the book of Luke a couple years ago. Occupy. We still have a mission. We still have something to do here. But the more wealth and the more stuff and the more things that we try and accumulate here, it's going to slow us down in our race. And the writer of Hebrews in chapter 12 encourages us, exhorts us to kind of cut those things loose. 2, it keeps us ready. Do we live in expectancy? We really like to shake our hands, or our heads. We like to shake our heads, yes. Do we live in expectancy? Do we live ready for his return? I don't want to make anybody feel bad about himself, but here's a little series of questions you can probably ask yourself. Do you spend more time in the Word, studying, reading, praying? Or do you spend more time in your hobbies? If you're to open up your checkbook, where does most of your funds go? Something that is furthering the ministry, something that is furthering the gospel, something that is furthering your whatever else. Are we trying to build a relationship with Christ daily through reading, through study, through prayer, knowing that it could essentially happen at any point in time, which we'll get into? We should be a little more kind of emboldened to speak. If you believe this text to be true, and essentially we should, as we discussed last week when Jesus is telling them, do you not see these great buildings? Not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down. That was a literal fulfillment of that prophecy. So we have to expect a literal fulfillment of the rest of it. If we truly believe this text, that means something really, really bad is coming. Do we share the gospel? When was the last time you shared the gospel with anybody? Or sat down and had a conversation through the word with anybody? Even something as small as handing out a tract, handing out a Bible. He tells us these things beforehand so we can get ready. That's the whole point in telling somebody beforehand, so that we can be ready. When the teacher tells us this is going to be on the test, this section is going to be on the test, this whole paragraph is going to be on the test, what are we going to spend a lot of time doing? Memorizing that section so that we can be ready for the test that is coming. But in those days, after that tribulation, so we're moving through that period of Jacob's trouble to the end, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars of heaven will fall, and the powers in heaven will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. So remember, it's important to keep it in context. It's really hard to do, especially in the Gospel of Mark, which is a shorter version of this discourse. I would encourage a study through Matthew 24 combined with Luke 21. But he's letting them know, if you see the abomination of desolation, these are the other things to look at until the end. You have to remember the disciples' question, Lord, when will these things take place? Essentially, what's going to happen to us? That's their big question. What is going to happen to the Jews? So Jesus is continuing with now after that tribulation. So now right there, right at the end, as we saw in the book of Revelation, the sun will be darkened, the moon won't give light, the stars will fall. And then he will send his angels and gather together his elect from the four winds, from the farthest part of the earth to the farthest part of heaven. They're going to be sent out to gather up those that are essentially saved during the tribulation but have not died. They'll be getting ready to go into the millennial kingdom. Now learn this parable from the fig tree. When its branches have already become tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer is near. So you also, when you see these things happening, know that it is near at the doors. Assuredly I say to you, this generation, well, we'll stop there. We're going to roll over to Matthew chapter 20 for this parable, or for this, the parable of the fig tree. So now learn this parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and put forth leaves, you know that summer is near. A lot of people have a hard time with this passage, especially mixed with the concept of this generation will not pass away. So first, let's back up into the concept of the fig tree. What is a fig tree a picture of? Any takers? Yeah, Israel, generally. The Gospel of Luke, for this same section, in chapter 21, he says, when you look at the fig tree and all the other trees. So if we're looking at the fig tree, I certainly would look at the fig tree. And when it's putting forth leaves, we see Israel become a nation again in 1948. That's a big deal. Not just the other dispersions, but the last 2,000 years, so scattered. It was so much that the Encyclopedia Britannica thought that their language was a dead language because their people were just so scattered. Until they spent more time in it. They're like, yeah, we were wrong. So they had to do a reprint, one of the few that they've had to do. But Jesus also says not just the fig tree, but all the other trees. What is he saying? Pay attention to the season. Let the reader understand. We can look outside and tell, without a calendar, especially here in Baker, what the changing of the seasons is going to look like, can't we? We know what winter is going to look like. We know what fall looks like. We're so excited for summer. Oh, it's for Baker. Your summer doesn't make any sense. I think last year, the year before, it snowed in June. That's ridiculous. So some of it might be a little bit squirrely. But he's calling to a place of knowing, watching, and be paying attention. We're going to continue on with verse 36 in Matthew 24. But of that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, but my Father only. But as the days of Noah were, so also will be the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days before the flood, they were eating, drinking, marrying, given in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and did not know until the flood came and took them all away. So also will the coming of the Son of Man be. Tricky little section that we've got here. Verse 36, no one knows. No one knows what? Do we know, roughly, the day of the Lord's return, when his feet smack down on earth? Kinda. Don't we? When is that going to happen? 1,260 days from the middle of the tribulation period. Now, we don't know when that period is, but from the abomination of desolation, he says it's going to be cut off halfway through the week. That leaves you with 3.5 years. So 3.5 years from that point is going to be the day of the Lord. What we don't know is the day of Christ, the blessed hope, as we call it at church. We don't know when the start of all of these things is going to be. We don't know the rapture of the church. But it is going to be an event that springs us into the next one. Not us, but everybody that's left here. The purpose of this text is to show the indifference of everybody. It says, just as in the days of Noah. What were in the days of Noah? We're going to look at it in two aspects. Verse 38, they were eating, drinking, marrying, giving in marriage, all the way up until Noah entered the ark. Noah preached against them the whole time he was building the ark. And so was Enoch before Enoch was taken up and Noah went into the ark. The whole time. It's like, yep, well, is what it is. You do you, we're going to do us. You be the crazy dude building a boat in the middle of the desert. We're going to keep doing what we're doing. Completely kind of for them, as it were, in their own mentality, caught off guard as this wrath was being poured out. If you look at the other aspect of it, this being drawn from Genesis chapter 6. What was it like in the days of Noah just before the flood? We saw a population explosion, perverted sexual practices, evil imagination, corrupt violence, perverse society. And for them, they were no longer shocked about a perverse society. We were immune to immorality, not ready, and just didn't care. It kind of sounds familiar. If you want to continue researching that one, that comes out of Genesis chapter 6. So verse 29 of Mark 13 says, so you also, when you see these things happening, know that it is near at the doors. He says, surely I say to you that this generation will by no means pass away. What does that mean, this generation? Scholars initially, their aspect was, well, all of you that are here right now in the Olivet Discourse, you will not die until this happens. It was 2,000 years ago. That's why everybody was looking so intently at the Apostle John. Apostle John was the last apostle to die. It's like, oh, he's the last one of this generation. Obviously, that doesn't fit. So there's two other aspects. The word for generation can also mean race. This race will not pass away until all of these things take place. That makes sense, especially when you put it back into context in the timeline. The generation, the Jews that see this thing take place, their race will not be wiped out till all things have been fulfilled. That's important. Jesus is answering very specifically the disciples' question. You will not go away. You're not going to die. All of the Jews will not fade away in this level of intense persecution. And he emphasized the certainty and the severity of it by saying that heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away. But at that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. That verse is highlighted and underlined in my Bible. And it should be for everybody, because we do three things. First thing, we just don't care. We come to that level of indifference. Well, he's coming or he's not coming. Whatever happens, happens. And we kind of slip into this fatalism mentality. It is what it is, and we just kind of live in indifference. We don't speak truth. We no longer speak life. It's like, oh, well, what is what shall be. Or, oddly enough, he says no one knows. So what are we going to do in our infinite wisdom? We're going to find out. And then we're going to tell everybody what the date is. How many date setters have we seen in the last 200 years? Tons. How many in the last 40 years? Even more. We're going to set this date. This is absolutely when Jesus is coming back. He skipped a passage that nobody knows. If you're curious on kind of the dark context of that verse, I would encourage you to watch. It's a documentary called Before the Wrath. Fantastic documentary. Kind of, some of you did see that here on movie night. So verse 33. Now we address, what do we do? What do we do? Where do we go from here with this information? These are all the things that are coming our way. And we have no idea when any of them are going to take place. What do we do? Verse 33, take heed, watch, and pray. To be alert. We're called in verse 14 to be in understanding, to be in the Word. Verse 33, called to be in prayer. Pray every day. Read your Bibles every day. Take heed and watch. Pay attention. Live light, live alert, for you do not know when the time is. It is like a man going to a far country who left his house and gave authority to his servants and to each his work and commanded the doorkeeper to watch. That's such an incredible verse. To each his work. Every single one of us within the body of Christ has a work. We have a job. We have a ministry, and we're each equipped to do that work. And it's one of the functions of the leadership of the church to help you figure out exactly what that work is supposed to be. And he also commanded doorkeepers to watch. Verse 35 again, watch therefore, for you do not know when the master of the house is coming. In the evening, at midnight, at the crowing of the rooster, or in the morning, lest, coming suddenly, he find you sleeping. And what I say to you, I say to all, watch. After we are saved, my friends, it's time to get busy. There's a lot of weird information in this little packet that was put together for me. Different idols, policies. We've seen here, and you're free to look through it, but we've seen in the news these organizations coming together to essentially start putting some of these things together. I did have one more quote that I wanted to read, but I can't find it. Yeah, that's a good one. This is from an article from Christians Together, from one of the architects of the EU. We do not want another committee. We have too many already. What we want is a man of sufficient stature to hold allegiance of all the people and to lift us out of the economic morass into which we are sinking. Send us such a man, and be he God or devil, we will receive him. That's bold. World leaders. Another one. This individual is calling for a multilateral level of governance with the teeth to function as an instrument of global governance where it is needed. That's an incredible thing, isn't it? So what do we do? One of the problems that the church has is a lack of focus. We take our eyes off of Christ and we put our eyes onto a problem. The Bible never says what the Antichrist's name is. You notice that? Even though this was given as revelation from something that hasn't happened yet. Why do you think that is? What would the church do? Or just some wacko with too much ammunition? Well, I'm going to find him, I'm going to shoot him. In fact, they made a series of books about that very thing. And if you look at the context of Revelation, it looks like somebody actually tried to do that. Because he was wounded for a time. We take our focus off of God and we put our focus onto the problem. We take our focus and put it onto the fierce situation. That's one issue that we have. Or two, we seem to think that we live in a period of reaping. My friends, we don't live in a time of reaping. We live in a time of sowing. We live in a time of encouraging people to understand and to pray, to preach Christ and him crucified. Those exhortations to take heed, watch, we see more in this section than some of the other exhortations through the rest of the word. We are called into a deeper relationship with Christ. If we focus on all of our problems, that's all we're going to see. We remember Peter stepping out of the boat. Lord, if it's you, you call me out into the water. That's awesome. That's a great thing to ask for. Not, Lord, if it's you, just get into the boat and make all this go away. He wanted something harder. We should want something harder because we grow through the harder things. He steps out on the water. He sees Jesus. What does he do? He's taking some steps. It wasn't until he took his focus off of Christ and onto the wave, onto the storm, that he started to sink a little bit. That's kind of the problem that we have. In something so hard, we're not called to be in fear. but rather called into a place of understanding. Because on top of take heed and watch and beware, we see several pretty strong warnings about false teachers. We have to be in our word. Because false preachers are getting more and more frequent. One of the last ones, within the last year, was that Jesus was a racist. And he had to repent. And it wasn't until he was rebuked by a woman that he repented. Completely trying to deconstruct, just like we saw in 1 John. Completely trying to deconstruct the deity and the sinless nature of Christ. If you have taken away his deity and his sinless nature, what are you left with? Not the Messiah. Not the Son of God. But how many of us can refute that kind of a teaching with something besides "nuh-uh"? It is a heavy place to be, but it's where we need to be. Why? We're not going to be here for this. But somebody else will be. And that is the heart of God. Taking the word out to the people. Let's pray together. Lord, thank you so much for the morning that you've blessed us with. And Lord, we're very thankful for even the severity of your word. We're very thankful, Lord, that we get to handle your word and we get to have this revelation, this insight into prophecy. Not because it's interesting, not because it's fascinating, not because we want to continue trying to break it down, but Lord, it's designed to make us move, and I pray it would do just that. That we would be boldened, that we would move, but also, Lord, that we would be living in expectancy. And I pray, God, that our word truly would be Maranatha. Come, Lord. And we love you and we praise you and pray in your name. Amen. Let's worship together.